Welcome everybody to November's Dance to the Music of Time 2025 reading group discussion. Great to see the turnout we've got. We are now officially in the downhill slope of, if you've got the of the dance, if you're going by the University of Chicago edition or the Little Brown edition as it was published in the US, you're on volume 4 now. And we'll be talking today about the first post-war volume of the dance, Books Do Furnish a Room. And I can see from the cameras that many of us agree with that idea of furnishing a room with a good collection of books. It's certainly my definition, although you don't see any behind me, but they're all on the other side of my room here. So we'll get started with the discussion in a couple minutes. I just want to kind of give a quick intro to this particular volume, a little scene setting, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. Whoops. I have got the wrong, I apologize for that. I'm going to have to actually pay attention to my slides when I share them. Excuse me just a moment. There we go. That's what I want to share. There. Okay. So we're on volume 10, Books Do Furnish a Room. Let me make sure that everybody can see that. So we're now in the post-war period, roughly in the late 45 to say 47, 48 time frame. It's a little bit rougher to date the events in this particular volume. The things that, of course, the larger framework politically, I think it's worth bearing in mind the sort of political environment that was going on at the time. So the general election in July of 1945 had kicked out the conservatives, brought in labor under Clement Attlee, and of course, Widmer Poole is elected as an MP on the side of labor. But in the geopolitical sense, things were still kind of in flux. So while Churchill made his famous Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946 in the US, Bolton, Missouri, declaring that essentially the Soviet power was taking over what we later knew as the Warsaw Bloc. In the UK, particularly because of the strong influence of socialist elements of the Labour Party, it wasn't quite so black and white. So here's a picture showing that as late as 1947, the Soviet ambassador to the UK was opening a Soviet art exhibit that included admiring portraits of Joseph Stalin. So, and we can kind of get flavors of that in the background of this book, as well as later on in Temporary Kings, where Widmer Poole's activities with some unspecified Eastern Bloc country become an issue for him in terms of his status in the party. For Poole himself, he was struggling to get back into fiction, and so he put his energies into the real life equivalent of Borage and Hellebore, Nick Jenkins' study of Robert Burton and the Anatomy of Melancholy. Poole published his biographical portrait of John Aubrey and his friends in 1948. at this point, both Nick and Pohl kind of become much more involved in the larger literary world of London and England. And as an example of that, I just wanted to note this. If any of you happen to have $41,000 hanging around and are interested, you can today pick up a copy of a letter from George Orwell to Pohl that was written in November of 1947 when Orwell was staying in this dismal, rough cottage on the Isle of Jura, just him and his son, his very young son. And this is actually where he did a lot of his work on 1984. Although I think by 47, the manuscript of 1984 was with the publisher. But this is a letter to Pohl. Dear Tony, it starts. So if you're interested, you can read the whole thing online at Abe Books. So it's completely optional whether or not you plunk them out the money to get a copy for yourself. We also see in this book, through the activities of the literary journal Fission, that it's a flavor of the time because there were a number of new magazines coming out for the literary world. Horizon had been started in 1939, but it really kind of took off in the post-war era. Also, John Layman, working with Penguin, had the new writing series, and there were other magazines that were perhaps not as prominent, but we kind of get a flavor of that. Although interestingly, Pohl himself wasn't really involved with these. Actually, he did a lot of his work for more mainstream journals such as Punch. Of course, a big character out of this time, Julian McLaren Ross, who is maybe one of the most closely fictionalized in terms of the resemblance between fact and fiction. The extractional character resembles in a lot of ways what we know of Julian McLaren Ross as a writer, and also in terms of his actions and behaviors as we see depicted in Books Do Furnish a Room. I'll mention, if you're interested in this period, if you'd like to get more, there is a lot more that's been written about the literary world during the war, but also in the near post-war period. A couple of books worth looking at, and interestingly that they both use the same photo on the cover. DJ Taylor's Lost Girls from 2015 or 2019, sorry, and then Hilary Sperling, Pohl's own biographer, wrote a much shorter book called The Girl from the Fiction Department, which is a portrait of Sonia Orwell. And just to give you a flavor of, pardon me, oops, I've lost it. Here it is. Sorry, I'm not well organized today. This is a quote from a review of DJ Taylor's book in the London Review of Books from December 2019. Just to give you a flavor of just how interwoven the lives of people in the literary world were at that time. Here the reviewer, Isenda Maxtone Graham, is sort of pointing out how complicated things were. And in fact, she starts her review by saying, I'm grateful that DJ Taylor unraveled these interconnections because it was beyond my capacity to figure them all out. So she writes, was Connolly still carrying on his affair with Diana Witherby when he started his affair with Lise? While still married to Jean and while Lise was still married to Ian, was Barbara Skelton having an affair with the Polish war artist Felix Topolsky when Peter Cannell came onto the scene, still married to his third wife, Glur, but making Topolsky so jealous that the men resorted to fisticuffs over Barbara? What made Janetta, still married to Hugh Slater, fall in love with Kenneth Sinclair Loutet? And would that relationship last? So that's just the mess around Horizon magazine. It gives you an idea of just how much a bed hopping was going on. So, and that very much comes across in this volume. But the big thing I think that we have to talk about today is Pamela, who comes onto the scene. Of course, we kind of meet her in the previous volume, but at this point, she comes on like a force majeure and takes over everybody's life she comes into contact with. So we're going to have some discussion about Pamela as a character and her role in really the next two volumes that we see. So with that, I will stop and let's open up the mic for comments and questions. First of all, just why Pamela and why Widmerpool? What brings those two characters together?
I think the lack of response, Brad, just is an indication that nobody really knows. I
That's
guess Woodman is a bit of a sadist. Um, he seems to enjoy having pain inflicted on him, and
a masochist.
Pamela
That
masochist,
would be a
sorry,
masochist, right? Yeah.
and Pamela certainly enjoys that element of her relationships with people.
Doris?
So I think it was Trapnell who said that having sex with her was like having sex with a corpse,
Yes,
right?
yes.
I mean, everybody wanted to, but she's a combination. It seems like, what do they call a nymphomaniac, and yet frigid, a combination.
Yeah, right.
And he doesn't seem to me sexual at all.
Leslie Hall, did you want to make a comment?
Well, this was a period when people were defining nymphomania as a combination of frigidity and a kind of promiscuity that went with that. But there doesn't seem, I mean, Pamela is just so out there. I mean, I'm not even sure she's actually being deliberately cruel. I mean, is she actually wanting to make these people suffer, or doesn't she even care? Is she just going her own way? I mean, does she just do things because she feels like it?
Well, the question I have is in the larger context of the work.
Mm.
She takes over the narrative in a way that no other character, not even Widmerpool, dominates, essentially captures the camera focus in the way that Pamela does for the next two volumes, for this volume and the next volume.
Yeah, I was wondering if she was based on any one of those women who appear in Lost Girls. I mean, I was thinking particularly of Barbara Skelton, who
Right.
sounds like an absolute hellion. I mean, I've come across her in previous works of the period, talking about all the extraordinary things she got up to. But I mean, there seems to be a coldness,
Mm-hmm.
an Arctic quality to Pamela that I'm not sure that Barbara had. Um, I, I don't know. Um, is there something? What was that? Was it a portrait, or is she, as people have said, a kind of force of nature, a kind of primeval
Right.
there's also a kind of primeval quality to her,
Absolutely.
a kind of a fury.
Well, she seems fierce, and certainly, I mean, some of this I think comes out of the BBC adaptation with Miranda Richardson's performance, which is a furious performance. I mean,
Yeah.
she never looks anything less than completely pissed off at the world. Uh, John Blackster, you had wanted to add a comment?
Just unmuting. Right. I was just going to say, her conquests. She does seem to find people that are either powerful or interesting, if we just take Templar, who had many good qualities and so on and so forth, then obviously Trapnell, Widmerpool himself, but then she'd, unlike a lot of women who would want to either support or help or even sort of bask in their light, she then takes it upon herself to destroy them. I mean, the only ones that I can think of that managed to clamber out of the spider's web are the Polish officer and possibly other foreign officers in London, and of course Odo Stevens as well, who came away pretty well intact. And I don't know if that's almost because they were, they had other value, other strengths or something like that. But I'm only just formulating that. I haven't really sort of looked into this and thought about it. But it does, there are a lot of women who have been terrific help to men. Let's say like Widmerpool, if he was an MP on the rise, it would have been wonderful to have had a wife that was obviously intelligent, lively, and attractive, and so on, and also perhaps could organise his schedule and make sure he had a nicely pressed shirt or whatever. And obviously Trapnell would be, so many women would have loved to felt like, I can really support this person. I'm they need a lot of looking after, and they're interesting and so on. But no, you sort of, like a child of its toy, it's sort of broken in a fit of I don't know, sort of pique or wanted to control the whole thing. Anyway.
Colin Griffiths.
Yeah, I kind of agree with John in the sense that pique is definitely part of her psyche, but I really think death is the big thing with Pamela. I know it's only starting to mature in books Do Furnish a Room, and it kind of comes to its fruition in the last two volumes. But she's to some extent a personification of death, I think, and she almost invites death and destruction upon those who come into close contact with her. And I think that's kind of an aspect of her that almost makes her kind of mythical, almost over and above what an ordinary person would be like.
Well, definitely Powell loves to make mythical references, perhaps less here than in the next volume. The parallels are there. It's an interesting thought, particularly, let's bear in mind, this was the age where the atomic bomb had been exploded. And yeah, okay. I have become Pamela, the destroyer of men, to use the line from the oh gosh.
From Oppenheimer.
Yeah, Oppenheimer quoting an Indian text, Bhagavad Gita, I guess. But yeah, I mean, there was there was a fear, maybe not quite in this period, because it was really, the Soviet Union had its atomic bomb in 1949. So that, I think it may be a little outside the period of Books Do Furnish a Room. But, there was an increasing fear of, the end of the world as an aspect of the Cold War developing. So,
and certainly from the point of view of the individuals with whom Pamela was associated, the end of the world became, well, fairly inevitable with Templar, who's been mentioned already, and Charles Stringham to some extent. And I think her destructive force contributed to Widmerpool's demise, ultimate demise further down the tracks.
Yeah. We have Raymond and then Richard.
Yeah, I was going to say that I don't at all believe in her relationship with Widmerpool. I find it entirely sort of implausible that she would be attracted to him, because all the evidence suggests that she's attracted to genuinely interesting people, which Trapnell is very much an example. Whereas Widmerpool is not. He's significant. he's a player, but he's not remotely interesting, really, when you get under the skin, I don't think. But maybe that's my thought on it.
No, I would suspect that a fair number of readers are mystified by what is it. Now, Pohl comments on numerous occasions, both in the novel and in his memoirs, that one never really knows what's going on inside standing from the outside, one never knows quite what's going on in a marriage. And so, one could simply use that to say, voila, I've just explained this problem away because it's mysteriousness. But let's hear, Richard, you have a comment?
Yeah, it's the two scenes that stand out for me is actually it's after she's left that house where she had her incident with the urn, and it takes a couple of pages for the characters to organize themselves sufficiently to clean up after her. And it seems that seems to be the motif of cleaning up after her. And the other one would be, of course, when Nick's at the dilapidated apartment or wherever where she's shacked up with the writer, and then there's a knock and they're expecting a bill collector, and he opens the door and it's Whitmerpool, because that's the motif throughout this whole thing. It's just he just keeps showing up.
Yeah.
And then we do get kind of a look at the relationship where Whitmerpool is exerting, it's like, okay, you're going to get over this and then you're going to come back to me. So I'm not. And then, of course, her destruction of the novel, cleaning up after that, literally like picking the pieces of paper out of the canal. It seems that she's just kind of this, as you're saying, force of, and the other characters, even Nick, are just stuck cleaning up after her. It's almost like one of my daughters told me the phrase that I hadn't heard before: "hot girl privilege." And that pretty much describes her. And
there's a lot to hot girl privilege. It reminds me of a comment a friend of mine used to make, which was that it's amazing how far a man can go in business if he looks like he belongs in a business suit.
Right.
And the same thing for women. Women who have a attractive public image are ceded power in a lot of relationships. And there's an argument that Pamela taps into that. One question I wanted to throw out for reaction was the timing. Sex has been, a subcurrent throughout the series so far, but now it really comes to the surface, and even more so in the next book. Now, Pohl is now writing this volume and the next volume are coming out in the late 60s, early 70s, when there was a lot of, we have Portnoy's complaint, we have Lolita having cleared all the censorship hurdles. And, the literature around him at that time was pushing sex as a much more, sexual liberation, but also using sex more freely in the theme. Do you think he was responding to that in some ways?
Can I just say that I think he was quite involved with the Lady Chatterley trial was that 1963, 64? He was present at it. He didn't actually speak at it. He was invited to be a witness for the defense, but I wasn't called. But he comments quite at some length on that subject in his autobiography, where he's kind of drawn in. He certainly has an interest in sex, I think, in a literary context. I think preferably where it's done well.
Yeah,
And his view, of course, of Lady Chatterley is that it's not done very well, and that's a fairly common
right.
view, I think.
Richard?
Well, yes, because the whole publishing subplot where they're worried about they're going to get brought up on charges for publishing this book, and and one of the lines that there's always several lines in these books that make me laugh out loud. He said, "Well, I didn't think it was particularly sexy, but obviously some other people did because they brought it up on charges." That this is kind of the opening, and it has to do also, and it's kind of entangled with this kind of progressive communist socialist attitude coming out of all of these public school grads, that there's this turn to the hard left, and you get even the hard, is it Gypsy, the hardened
Right.
communist, like trying to suppress the publication of it's Odo's memoir about hanging out with the resistance, the communist resistance, and how it's thwarted at the end, very again, very funny way. So yeah, I think it's like the loosening of not so much the like people having more sex. It's just that the whole society seems to be kind of coming undone, and leaning toward the left here, both in the talking about sex and in politics and socialism, and how Widmerpool probably has, he's just, aping what he's hearing. He just probably sees this as an opportunity. So yeah, I think it's whole part of the whole book. It's just fascinating that, yeah, as you were pointing out, how the left was so much more open in Britain, because in the United States at this point you had the McCarthy hearings and the
Right.
whole whole Red Scare. It's not something that's happening, and doesn't seem to be something that's happening in Britain.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that struck me with this and the next book is that there were moments when I feel like Nick Jenkins, the observer, starts to verge into Nick Jenkins, the voyeur. He has a bit of a fascination with other people's sex lives that goes a little bit further than anything we've seen previously in the novels. Do you think that's an exaggeration? Am I mischaracterizing it? We have John and then Leslie.
No, I don't think so. Without in a just a fairly, I think he had an amused interest. I don't think he was literally a voyeur, but
No.
having doing the calendars that we've done for the last couple of years, and looking through those scrapbooks. I mean, the sort of Baroque images of sort of curtains revealing sort of French, possibly 19th century sort of houses of ill repute. That sort of thing, is used a lot in his scrapbooks. The actual imagery, but also the way things are sort of cut and pasted and little theatrical bits and pieces. I think he took an amused interest in sex, in other people's sex lives, and to some extent, the more, I don't mean bizarre in terms of strange practices, but just, well, rather like you were talking at the beginning about the tangled web of all those characters together, that sort of thing. Just like his interest in genealogy was the idea of trying to work out exactly who was related to whom, and what was that. But he liked sort of unpicking that sort of thing. I think if somebody said to him, "Do you think so and so judging by the way they behaved at that dinner party, do you think they might be having I think he would have been quite fascinated in unpicking that and seeing if there were clues. Just to clear up one or two things in my own mind, the Lady Chatterley's trial was 1960, which was quite a long time before before Books Do Furnish a Room was published, which was 1971. But interestingly enough, 1971, I was a student then, and I was interested in counterculture and partly member of it. And Oz Magazine, that was when the backlash, and Oz Magazine, that the establishment said enough is enough. And that was the big trial, which did have a lot of people like John Mortimer and David Hockney coming as witnesses and supporting them. And although they were initially sent off to the Tower of London to be executed, the editors were actually on appeal. They were released, and things was a sigh of relief and things like that. Now, all of that relates. There are comments in Books Do Furnish a Room, aren't there, about what's his name being sued for Sweetskin, the book Sweetskin being sued, and because we don't want books going to prison because some liverish old judge has decided that that's inappropriate. Now, that is absolutely what people thought about Judge Argyle, I think his name was, who was very much a judge of the old school. And one thing he was not very happy about was hippies, long-haired people, and people publishing books which were, was a sort of backlash. It had been 10 years of what had happened since Lady Chatterley's Lover's trial. Lady Chatterley, the trial of the book that had been one. Penguin had published. It had 10 years of what had happened. The floodgates had been opened, and there was a sort of last-ditched attempt to try and get censorship back into the highest courts in the land, and people publishing filth sent off with long periods of prison, and of course having their hair cut very short.
Right. Leslie, I'd love to hear your comments here.
Well, speaking as someone who has certain knowledge of the history of censorship, the floodgates did not open. There was still a lot of censorship, obscenity trials throughout the 60s and well into the 70s before the Oz trial. I mean, things like Fanny Hill were being brought to being, subject to prosecution. So, it's not as though there was this sudden liberation. And that is just a point. But what I was actually interested in this point about Nick as voyeur, because I had this sense, it's not just in the sexual sense, in that he's just hanging around and he just happens to be there when things are happening. It's very odd.
Especially in this book.
It's like, hello, you're just an ordinary person who's a bystander, and yet you're somehow in the position of the omniscient narrator. This is very odd, Nick, and mind you, this is a thing I have noticed in other novels of the same period, that you get a character who is not actually involved in whatever the plot is, who nonetheless happens to, be the confidant of various people or present at various key scenes. And it's like, you can't have an omniscient narrators anymore, but you have to have somebody who is wise to what's going on. And Nick does seem to me to be fitting in a bit to that. And it just strikes me as a kind of a period convention of fiction of that post-war era. Where they had, they were trying to kind of get round we can no longer have the omniscient narrator because that is like Victorian, and we don't do that anymore. And they had not got into kind of experimental narration.
Right.
But that's just a thought.
There's a point I want to come back to on that, but we have a couple of folks who have comments. So let's get Colin and then Doris.
Yeah, I suppose the point I want to make is that Powell himself, in looking at the sex act as it portrayed in novels, takes the view that you can either look at it, that the novelist can look at it from the point of view of either participant or as the voyeur looking at it from the godlike view, if you like, watching the action. And he makes the point that from his point of view, he would be the voyeur,
Yeah.
for what that's worth in terms of.
Well, I think that links into Leslie's comment about, novelists having to choose, how do they carry the narrative forward if they're not going to continue with an omniscient narrator viewpoint. If it's going to be personalized, then somebody's got to be, you're going to be in bed, or you're going to be standing beside the bed or behind the curtains. But
Perhaps
Doris,
it's
you have a
easier
comment?
behind the curtains.
Yeah, probably. Doris, a comment?
Just speaking to that, the best example is Gatsby, with Nick Carraway.
True.
No one else would know all those things. But I wanted to talk about a different part of Nick. I was just so surprised the way it might have been right at the beginning where he said, I was enrolling a son at school.
Right.
He didn't say my son.
I
He's
know.
so
I know.
like this with his own life. And then when Isabel was having another child, Isabel was having I don't exactly remember the words, but he's so reticent about his own life.
Absolutely. I mean, this we talked about this a couple of months ago, because as a father, I just find that just unfathomable that you would refer to your own child as the child, or a son was born, or that if you're a parent and that's not like a huge event in your life that shapes, and unless something tragic happens to your child, they're a part of your life for the rest of your life. And I mean, part of it is the British upperclassness that the children are had and then they're shuffled off. But Paul wasn't so rich that he turned his kids over to the care of the servants. They didn't disappear off the scene. But in Nick's case, it seems to be part of his whole let's push my family behind the curtain. Maybe that's the analogy we need to be using here. But let's have Judith.
Thank you. I think I sort of noticed that, and it made me smile because I'm in no way any sort of upper class aristocratic British person, but I do occasionally talk about my now grown up children. I will say to my husband, "Oh, there's a child on the phone," or something like that, and I think it's a distancing, and it because one of the things that seemed implausible to me, sort of slightly strange in this novel, is that this is a well-established, presumably quite successful writer. He's clearly got a family, he's got a wife. If he's living in a part of London where he can pop out at night and see these people, he's quite well off. And it's to me that in reality, this sort of person would go home at night, and if he's working with these people and their complicated love lives, he's as likely as not to shut the door and say, "Oh, thank goodness I don't have to deal with that again until tomorrow morning." And actually, there's a sort of a strange distancing and putting to one side, as you say, of his personal life to focus on this sort of, I don't know, soap opera really that's going on around him.
No, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I spent a lot of my military career dealing with relatively hush-hush sorts of things. And one of the great things about working in that kind of environment is when you lock the office, you have to leave everything, but you cannot take your work home, so to speak. And it was wonderful. You really could shut it off and just focus on your family when you went home. A couple of comments that I wanted to throw out as well, because it relates to Nick as I think one of the things I keep wondering, reading it this time around, is to what extent Nick can be considered a character and to what extent he's a fictional device for Powell. That one of the reasons we don't see that much about him is that Powell, I think, is really reluctant to use him as a character as opposed to the narrator who ties these facts together. And one of the other aspects that we see here, and in particularly in the next book with the whole incident at Odo Stevens' party, is that there's this Rashomon effect that Powell has Nick sort of do, where he kind of recounts that there's multiple versions of the story that's gone on, that as if he's really in conversation multiple times with different people, gone over an incident. So it's seen from, just like Rashomon, where the episode is seen from the standpoint of multiple observers. Nick gives you the impression that he's actually spent a considerable amount of time engaging or just stumbling into conversations where people talk about the same episode again and again and again, because the little details come out. But Leslie, you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, is Nick a character? And this made me think of what I've been thinking about Isabel's presence in the novels, which tends to be a fleeting scene, one line of dialogue. I think in books Do Furnish a Room, she gets like one line. And in the previous novel, I think she had perhaps two lines. And she's barely a presence. And I think that's kind of possibly fits in with is he a character? Because if she was more of a presence, that would give him more of a presence as a character.
Yeah, absolutely.
That her absence is part of his tenuousness, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree with that. A couple of things I want to, good comments in the chat that I'd like to make sure we don't lose. First of all, anyone who's seen Guy Robinson's comment about running into one of Peter Cannell's ex-wives would probably love to hear some more about that, since she was one of the lost girls of D.J. Taylor's book of that period. Also, if you're not aware, Wesley Stace has an ex-Trapnell sort of tribute song called Ride Your Camel, if you're interested in that, because he literally refers to the camel ride to the tomb in the lyrics of that song. So there's a link in the chat to the YouTube video if you want to take a look at that. And then also a comment about noticing that Widmer Pools seems to have shuffled his mother off stage at this point. And in fact, he's pushed her away in a closet as far from London as possible, which is a real contrast from his doting son years, in his pre-war doting son years, where he was living with his mother and constantly chatting up her qualities when he ran into Nick. And now it's like, oh yeah, I have a mother. Oh, I shoved her up to some nowheresville in Scotland so that she doesn't interfere with my political ambitions. Richard, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in this novel we get at least two female kind of burgeoning or blossoming novelists who are referenced here, and they seem to be kind of in the same genre as what Nick is writing about, except of course now he's writing about the Anatomy of Melancholy. But then one of them starts out as Sillery's secretary, and how they kind of his memoir, his diary. It doesn't necessarily sink the publishing company, but doesn't seem to help it. The other things, I missed the first. I missed the discussion on the first book. Has anybody discussed Sillery as a character? Because when I read the first book the first time, which is many years ago, it really hit me how similar he was to anybody read Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince?
Slughorn, is that what the guy's called?
He's Slughorn, yeah. I mean, and I was just wondering if that was if Rowling got it directly out of this book, or that's just kind of a trope of English literature to have the Don or the teacher kind of vampirically absorbing the energy of his students and using them for his advantage. I mean, because it's like Slughorn has exactly doing exactly the same things. He's got the pictures of the students, and then he has these like get-togethers, just like Stillery did. And then, in fact, we see Nick go back to one of them, which is like weird because it's kind of like being in a dream where you're back in school.
I have to laugh because I have to say a recurring life nightmare throughout my life has been going back to some place that I left and, realizing I don't belong there anymore.
Right.
I seriously don't belong back in school, back in some old workplace,
Why-
whatever it is.
Why am
I
I?
will say that Sillery taps into a perhaps not broad, but certainly a strong theme for both Oxford and Cambridge, which was there were the dons that cultivated salons. And most explicitly, it's been suggested that Sillery is sort of a version of Morris Balra. There were dons, and particularly at this time, they were the ones who would appear on the BBC Brains Trust, and they'd be writing and they'd be teaching and they'd be cultivating disciples that would follow on in their way. So I think Sillery, is very much a reference to that kind of aspect of the Don culture that you saw in those coasts. Not that I ever went there, but a couple of comments coming up. We have, let me just take them in order as I see. So Judith, and then Sally and John.
Thank you. Just to go back to the comment that was made about Widmerpool's mother, and I think I wasn't on the last session, so you might have discussed Widmerpool's sort of rise in the war, but it seems to me that there's a real divide. That before the war, yes, he's apparently getting some success in business, but there seems to be at least as much annoyance and irritation with him. After the war, he's benefited from that sort of the opportunities that rising through the ranks has, or as an officer has provided him in a way that it's allowed him to perhaps show off his skills. I mean, there's lots of comments about his hard work and his dedication, but he strikes me as one of those people. I can think of a few I've worked for like this, where they really do seem to rise quite high, and nobody can quite believe it because everybody sort of understands that they're really quite difficult, but at the same time, nobody ever seems to sort of, I suppose, call them out on it. And it seems to me that that's what's happened to Widmerpool. And then post-war, he's found himself in the opportunity to get a seat, which I think is in a by-election. It's not in the 1945
Yeah,
election.
no, it's not 1945 because he's still on active duty. And
yeah. So he's kind of catching up, if you like.
yeah.
But that seems to have made a big change in his life, and that possibly is associated with the marriage, because he's got this very attractive, glamorous wife who certainly will look good even if she doesn't, as he finds out, behave herself. But also this idea of, I cannot imagine Pamela putting up with a mother-in-law. So shunting her off to the lowlands of Scotland.
Yeah, right.
Thing to do if that's.
It might have been Pamela's doing as much as Widmerpool's. That's a good point. Let's get Sally and then John.
I was just going to comment on your comment about looking back and the nightmare, and that is really the war. I mean, this is the first novel that's post the last 6 years, and it's almost like a post-traumatic stress syndrome that they're going through. They've been washed ashore on, after this dangerous period, and he's looking back, and it's a nightmare. But
yeah. Well, and the post-war period was pretty grim in many ways for England. Rationing was still going on for a number of years after the end of the war. didn't have the economic resurgence that perhaps was expected. In fact, if you've ever seen the series The World at War, right at I think the last episode in that, the historian Stephen Ambrose comments, he says, well, it's not particularly clear who won World War II, but it's clear that Britain lost. Because it certainly lost in terms of political status, economic status, etc. John Walters?
I thought it'd be interesting to bring into the discussion something about Fission, the magazine. And I don't know if there's anyone else in the discussion who's worked on magazines. I've worked on lots of little magazines over the years, and it feels to me that Bagshaw is a really convincing person. I'm sure I've met him, possibly worked for him at some point, and that both he and Nick are kind of avatars for Powell in the way that what they have in common is that they do keep their private lives out of the equation, which is something you do if you're an editor or a section editor commissioning. You know, the person you focus your attention on is the person you want to squeeze a book review out of, by whether it means going to the pub or, you know, sending lots of emails or talking on the phone. And, you know, the interesting person then is the writer, the person you're commissioning. And I think both, you know, Powell was, I'm not quite sure the timeline. Don't think Powell had, at that time, Powell hadn't worked for Punch, but by the time he wrote Books Do Furnish a Room, he'd had all that experience doing the books reviews for Punch and then the Telegraph. And I think he weaves in lots of personal wisdom and sort of humor about that relationship that an editor has, who is also a writer, an editor has with the contributors. And just on a personal level, I thoroughly enjoy that aspect of this book.
Yeah, yeah. Insight into the editorial process, both for books and, you know, both as the publisher and as the magazine editor, and the considerations of that.
Quiggin and Craggs are great characters as well, with the the spectre of Gypsy, you know, trying to interfere with Odo Stevens' books. A book, you know, that feels also quite real. Although I haven't been involved with book publishers, and my experience is in magazines mainly.
Yeah. And I have to say, in the 60s and particularly the 70s, there was a lot of fiction coming out, particularly from America, but also in the UK, that was about, you know, writers and the life of writers and the daily issues of writers and academics. And Books Do Furnish a Room manages to be about those things without becoming self-obsessed as so many of those novels are. I mean, particularly, there's a lot of fiction from the late 60s and early 70s that's just practically unreadable today because it's so onanistic.
I missed out the other great avatar, which is Trapnell, of course, who is allowed to speak a lot of Powell's thoughts about the novel writing process.
Right.
And again, you know, makes the book very rich on that level. And I agree, it does hold its own against other books of that time that talk about the writing process.
Colin, you have your hand
Yeah, I
raised?
think Bagshaw for me is a wonderfully entertaining comic character. I particularly like the way he anatomizes the left-wing people's approach to being left, you know, syndicalists, anarcho-syndicalists, nihilist, communist, Trotskyists, and all the rest. I think that's a very funny paragraph. But I suppose the thing that keeps coming to my mind is, was he Malcolm Muggeridge? And what's the relationship between Bagshaw and Muggeridge?
He does go on to have a TV career, doesn't he?
Yes, exactly.
He does. And you get the sense that Bagshaw has led the dissipated part of Muggeridge's life. We don't see the more holy part that came later.
Yeah. Well, I mean, both Bagshaw and Quiggin followed the sort of the Muggeridge path of becoming talking heads, but not actually producing work of any lasting substance.
Yes.
You know,
Right.
the lights of television studios became their drug, I guess.
Yes.
Okay. Any other? We're coming up on the hour. John Blackster, you have a comment?
It's a little bit retrospective as usual. But I was just thinking, we a few minutes ago we were talking about Widmerpool suddenly coming out of a war and suddenly being somebody who was a man of importance politically. Well, you know, I mean, the war did do that a lot. There's two fantastic examples, or two very good examples, and that's Edward Heath and Dennis Healey. Edward Heath, and they're good because they're opposite. Obviously, Edward Heath was a Conservative leader, and Dennis Healey might have been a Labour Party leader, but they had both been friends before the war at university, quite close friends. And Edward Heath got a lot of glory out, I mean, deserved glory for his part in the D-Day landings, and Dennis Healey with the Anzio campaign. That's slightly different from Widmerpool, whose record in the war was important, as actually it is mentioned in the book that you know, wars are not necessarily won by people just you know, charging at the enemy waving a saber, but organization is vastly important. So his qualities must have been perhaps spotted by people, and then in the political fray after the war, they said, well, there's that chap Widmerpool, he's a good organization man.
Yeah. Well, you know, Widmerpool, it seems to me, excels as what the French would call a fonctionnaire, which means he's a, you know, he's a bureaucrat. He knows how to, I mean, that's why he succeeds once he goes to the cabinet office, is that he's a master of doing the grinding day in, day out staff work, but also manipulating the system. What he isn't, I don't think, as convincingly, is a leader. And I think that might be why his political career, I mean, his career as an MP is rather short-lived, because he's much more of a behind-the-scenes operator than he is the one to stand, you know, behind the podium and pontificate, and to actually communicate and reach a constituency. John Gould, I see your hand raised.
Very quickly, in regards to that last remark, let's recall Widmerpool's last words in Hearing Secret Harmonies. I'm leaving.
Oh, yes, yes. I'm in the lead. John Blackster?
No, well, just a very brief point. I like the Muggeridge's fascination with all the different combinations of socialism and peoples and so on. But how many parties? I think that's Powell would have loved Jeremy Corbyn's. You can't, you know, you form a party and then you can't actually work out what a name is. And then somebody else said, no, it's a different name. No, that's, you know, already we're only two people in it. Already they've got two parties.
Well, there was certainly a streak, you know, a very strong streak of that through the leftist politics, both in the U.S. and in the UK. That the various factions. I mean, that was in the early days of the Russian Revolution, the interbloodletting among all the leftist movements to figure out who was in charge, until, you know, Lenin in his ruthlessness kind of bulldozed over all of them, using the point of a gun instead of a political fine point to make his point. Okay, we're coming up on the hour. Any last comments folks want to make? Just a reminder that next month we will be meeting on the 1st of December, talking about Volume 11, Temporary Kings, which is a fascinating, perhaps, it's funny, from what I gather, this seems to be either people's favorite or least favorite book in the series. And so I hope if you're on one camp or the other, next month we can take some time to talk about the pros and cons. And I'll just do another plug. If you're interested in a reading group like this, we will be running, or I will be facilitating a reading group in 2026, reading a very different book, Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage. So if you want to find out about that, go to readingpilgrimage.com and you can join the email list for the announcements about those sessions. So with that, I will say thank you all for joining us. Well, Rich, is that, that's a wave goodbye. Okay, thank you. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you in December. All the best.
Thank you.
There's a land of beginning again, where skies are always blue. Though we've made mistakes, that's true. Let's forget the past and start life anew. Though we've wandered by a river of tears, where sunshine won't come through, let's find that paradise where sorrow can't live, and learn the teachings of forget and forgive in the land of